He didn't sleep alone, not because of weakness, not because of fear, but because of something far more ancient, far more deliberate, something written into the very architecture of the world he walked through. We tend to imagine Jesus resting in silence, wrapped in a clean robe, alone in a peaceful room, somewhere between miracles. But that image belongs to us, not to him. It belongs to our world of private bedrooms, individual blankets, and central heating. It does not belong to first-century Galilee. It does not belong to the villages of limestone and dust where he ate, slept, argued, laughed, and taught. So what did sleep actually look like in the world Jesus inhabited? Who was beside him? Why did it matter? And what does that tell us about the man who said, "The Son of Man has no place to lay his head," and yet was never truly alone on the coldest nights? Stay until the end, because understanding this changes how we read the Gospels. To understand why no one in that world slept alone when winter pressed in, you have to start not with theology, but with stone. Specifically, with the kind of stone used to build homes in the villages of the Lower Galilee. Basalt and limestone, dense and cold, walls that absorbed the chill of night and held it like a vault. These were not insulated structures. They were ancient thermal containers that worked brilliantly in summer, keeping interiors cool through the long, dry heat, but became brutal in the wet months of Kislev and Tevet. The Jewish winter, when temperatures in the Galilean highlands could drop sharply after dark and rain came sideways off the Mediterranean. If this is your first time here and you want to keep going deeper into the world that shaped Jesus, the places, the sounds, the daily realities behind the gospel stories, consider subscribing. There's much more where this is coming from. A typical village home in the Galilee of Jesus' time was not large. Archaeologists working sites like Capernaum and Nazareth have uncovered what scholars call insular clusters, groupings of small interconnected rooms built around shared courtyards, housing extended families across generations. A single household might include grandparents, parents, unmarried siblings, newly married children, and their infants, all sharing 2 or 3 rooms of roughly 20 to 30 square meters total. Privacy, as we define it today, was not a cultural value. It was not even a concept that had architecture built around it. The floor was beaten earth or rough stone. The roof was wooden beams layered with packed mud and brush, functional but never entirely waterproof. The smell inside a family home was the smell of bodies, of cooking oil, of the animals that were sometimes brought in from the lower room at night. The small courtyard space that doubled as a stable. When cold threatened the livestock, a family could not afford to lose. Heat came from a single source, a small clay brazier or a cooking hearth set low in the floor, burning olive wood or dried dung, producing warmth in a narrow radius and filling the room with a thin haze of smoke that clung to hair, fabric, and skin. And when the fire dimmed after the third watch of the night, the only remaining warmth was the warmth of bodies pressed together under shared cloaks and woven wool coverings. This was not intimacy as sentiment, this was survival as structure. The cloak, in Hebrew, simla, in Greek, himation, was not simply clothing. To reduce it to an article of dress is to miss almost everything important about it. In the world Jesus walked through, the outer cloak was simultaneously a garment, a blanket, a sleeping mat, a carrying sack, and in the most desperate circumstances, a form of collateral. The Torah itself recognized this reality so plainly that Exodus 22 legislated around it. If a man gave his cloak as a pledge against a debt, it had to be returned to him before sundown, not as a courtesy, as a survival requirement, because without it, he could not survive the night. That single legal provision tells you everything about the thermal vulnerability of ordinary people in the ancient Near East. A cloak was not a luxury, it was a life boundary. the thin woven line between endurance and exposure. Most families owned one cloak per person, sometimes fewer. The weaving of wool fabric was slow, labor-intensive work, done primarily by women on hand looms, requiring weeks of effort for a single garment of any quality. Fabric wore out, fabric was repaired, patched, re-repaired, until the patches themselves began to fail, which is precisely why Jesus chose that image when he spoke of new cloth sewn onto old garments. His audience did not need an explanation. Every person listening had held a cloak up to the light and seen the thinning fibers, had felt the cold seep through a patch that didn't hold. When a family lay down to sleep on a winter night, they pooled what they had. Cloaks were layered over bodies arranged close together on reed mats or woven straw pallets placed directly on the floor. The youngest children were placed at the center, insulated by the bodies of older siblings and parents on either side. The elderly, whose bodies no longer generated sufficient warmth, were drawn into the same human cluster. This was not optional generosity. This was the physics of survival, translated into family structure. The Gospel of Luke preserves a parable that only makes complete sense inside this architecture. A man arrives at his neighbor's house at midnight, an outrageous hour, and knocks, asking for bread because an unexpected guest has arrived and he has nothing to set before him. The neighbor answers from inside, "Do not bother me. The door is already locked, and my children and I are in bed." Modern readers imagine a man reluctant to get up from a comfortable mattress, but the Greek behind that phrase describes a scene far more physically complex. The entire household, children, adults, possibly an elderly relative, is lying together on the floor in a single warm cluster. To get up is not to swing your legs off a bed. It is to disentangle yourself from a layered arrangement of bodies and coverings, to let the cold air rush into the space you just vacated, to wake the children pressed against you, to disturb the thermal architecture that took hours of shared body heat to build. Jesus told that parable to explain persistence in prayer, but he told it in a room where every person listening had been that neighbor, had felt that reluctance, had calculated the cost of getting up. The teaching landed not as metaphor, but as memory. And this is the world in which Jesus himself moved, ate, and rested. He did not carry wealth. The gospel accounts make clear he owned, in material terms, almost nothing beyond the clothes he wore. When he traveled with the 12 and the broader group of disciples, they moved as a collective, shared what was brought to them, and slept as communities sleep. Close, layered, interdependent. Cold was not an abstraction for him. It was a physical reality he navigated with the same tools available to everyone else. Proximity, shared covering, the warmth of other human beings who had chosen to walk the same road. There is a village in the Galilean hills where archaeologists found the remains of a first-century home with a hearth positioned almost exactly at the geometric center of the main room. Not near a wall, not tucked into a corner, at the center. The placement was deliberate, calculated across generations of cold nights and practical knowledge. A central hearth radiates outward in all directions equally. It allows the maximum number of bodies arranged around it to receive heat from a single fuel source. It was not aesthetic design. It was thermal mathematics solved by people who had no margin for error. That margin, or the lack of it, is essential to understanding the social texture of Jesus' world. In an economy built almost entirely on subsistence agriculture and artisan labor, the difference between a family that survived winter intact and a family that did not was often measured in very small units. A cloak lost to debt, a child too sick to generate body heat, a roof that leaked and soaked the sleeping mats, a season's olive harvest that came in light, leaving too little oil for the lamp and too little coin for the market. Poverty in first-century Galilee was not a background condition. It was an active daily negotiation between what you had and what the night required. This is why hospitality in the ancient Near East was not merely a social custom. It was a moral architecture load-bearing enough to hold entire communities together through seasons of scarcity. To receive a traveler was to pull another body into the warmth of your household cluster. To feed a stranger was to extend your fire's radius by one more life. The obligations of hospitality, xenia in the Greek world, hachnasat in the Jewish tradition, were not suggestions for the generous. They were structural commitments enforced by community expectation, religious obligation, and the unspoken knowledge that next winter you might be the one knocking. Jesus moved through this network constantly. The Gospel of Luke alone records him eating in someone's home no fewer than 10 times. He accepted invitations from Pharisees, from tax collectors, from women of means who supported his movement, from fishermen in their village houses by the lake. He was not a hermit in the desert, surviving on ascetic discipline. He was a man who understood that human life in that world was lived collectively, and that the table and the sleeping mat were both sites of profound theological meaning, precisely because they were first sites of profound human need. When he sent out the 72 disciples in Luke 10, his instructions were nakedly practical. Carry no purse, no bag, no sandals. When you enter a house, stay there, eating and drinking what they give you. Do not move from house to house. He was not designing a spiritual exercise in detachment. He was describing the actual mechanics of movement through a village network, the way a traveling teacher survived without independent resources, by becoming temporarily woven into the hospitality fabric of each community he entered. The disciples who followed him on those journeys did not sleep in inns as a rule. Inns were expensive, located on major roads, and carried a social stigma in Jewish culture, places where travelers of unknown character mixed in compromised circumstances. Village hospitality was cleaner, safer, and warmer in every sense of the word. They slept in homes, in rooms where other bodies were already arranged on the floor, where children breathed slowly in the dark, where the smell of the evening meal still clung to the walls, where a clay lamp burned low near the door, not for decoration, but because total darkness in a household with children and elderly members was its own kind of danger. And Jesus lay down among them, not apart, not elevated. Among the Son of Man, who had no permanent place to lay his head, laid it wherever the warmth of human community allowed, and in doing so embodied precisely what he would later say in the parable of the sheep and the goats. I was a stranger, and you took me in. He knew what he was talking about. He had been that stranger. He had felt what it meant to be received. There is one night in the Gospel accounts that stands apart from all the others. Not because of a miracle, not because of a sermon, but because of a detail so small that most readers pass over it without pausing, not realizing that it contains, compressed inside it, the entire weight of what it meant to be human and cold and watching in the dark. The night before his crucifixion, Jesus went to Gethsemane. He took with him Peter, James, and John, the same 3 who had been present at the Transfiguration, the same 3 who had watched him raise Jairus' daughter. He did not go alone. He never went alone. Even in his most interior moment of anguish, he brought bodies with him into the dark. John 18 tells us that the servants and officers who came to arrest him had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were warming themselves. The Greek word used is anthrakia, a charcoal brazier. The same word appears only one other time in John's Gospel, at the courtyard where Peter stands warming himself by another charcoal fire when he denies Jesus 3 times. The Gospel writer placed these 2 fires in deliberate parallel. The cold was not incidental atmosphere. It was the shared physical condition of everyone present on that night. Soldiers, servants, disciples, and the man at the center of all of it. It was the month of Nisan, early spring in Jerusalem, but Jerusalem sits at nearly 800 meters of elevation. Nights in Nisan are cold. The stones of the Temple Mount hold the chill of winter long into spring. The Garden of Gethsemane, on the western slope of the Mount of Olives, would have been dark, damp, and biting after midnight, and the disciples fell asleep. 3 times Jesus returned and found them sleeping. We read this as spiritual failure, and perhaps it was. But it was also the sleep of men who had walked for days, who had eaten a large meal, who were lying on cold ground in the dark with no fire, whose bodies were doing exactly what cold, exhausted human bodies do when they finally stop moving. They were not villains in that moment. They were humans at the edge of their physical capacity, in a world where sleep and warmth and safety had always arrived together, and now for the first time could not. Jesus prayed alone in that garden, for perhaps the only sustained period of genuine physical solitude recorded in the Gospels, and the text preserves his sweat falling like drops of blood. The body under stress, so extreme it expressed itself through the skin. He was not serene. He was not composed. He was a man in the grip of full human terror, feeling the cold of the ground beneath him and the cold of what was coming, and asking, with everything he had, whether there was another way. There was not, and he knew it before he asked. What followed? The arrest, the trials, the hours of exposure, the cross erected in the open air of a Jerusalem morning, was a sequence of deliberate humiliations that stripped away every layer of protection the ancient world afforded human dignity. The cloak that soldiers gambled for at the foot of the cross was not a minor detail. It was the last material boundary between a human body and the world's indifference. They took it, they took everything, and yet the resurrection accounts, all 4 of them, begin before dawn, in the cold, in the dark, with women moving through empty streets toward a tomb, carrying spices, wrapped in their own cloaks against the chill of early morning. The stone is already rolled away. The grave clothes are folded. The warmth has already returned to what was cold. We spend so much of our faith life in the abstract, in doctrines and systems and carefully constructed arguments. But the world that produced the gospel was a world of stone floors and shared cloaks and charcoal fires and bodies pressed together against the night. It was a world where warmth was never guaranteed and was therefore never taken for granted, where every act of hospitality was a small defiance of exposure, where to receive someone into your home on a cold night was to say, with your body before you said it with your mouth, you will not face this alone. Jesus never slept alone on the coldest nights because no one did. Because the world he inhabited had learned across centuries of hard seasons that survival was a collective act. And when he taught from inside that knowledge, not above it, not beyond it, but from within the smell of the fire and the weight of the shared cloak and the sound of breathing in the dark. That is where the gospel was born. Not in abstraction, in the cold, and in the warmth that answered it.